So let's go ahead and actually show what this does. So what should happen is that when we run this, it should essentially have the same output as the other method did, which is we have all the data that's been parsed out into all the different objects. So it should be the exact same output as the other one. Do I have this on? No, I don't. So I'm going to turn that on now. So I'm going to go and load the map. Okay. So here, if we look at our thing here, we can see we have our recursive function in there now. We have all the other code out of there. And we have our parse map data. So we have two objects in here. One is map 1, one is map 2. In map 1, we have an NPC list that has two objects in it. NPC 1, NPC 2. And NPC 1 has a dialog list. NPC 2 has its dialog list. If we go to map 2, we can see that these NPCs have their dialog lists as well. And everything is properly parsed and the way it's supposed to be. So now if we're looking at this, you can see this is much shorter, much more compressed, a lot less code needed, and barring some specific circumstances, this should work in any use case we have and in any amount of data depth we have. So if we added another object, we don't have to change anything because we're looking at the values itself and we're going through each stage recursively. If we change any of the key names, doesn't matter because we're looking at the values. We're using a dynamic way to handle the keys, so the specific keys don't matter. Whereas in the other way, if you changed a key, you had to change that key in all the places that we mentioned. Here, it doesn't matter. It just uses the keys inside of data to go through and pull out that stuff. If it's something that can be parsed, it parses it and throws it back into the function, parses it again, you get all the data back. Very clean, very simple, very short. Probably not too many ways it can be broken, and it can handle any amount of data without having to have a whole bunch of for loops called at the same time. Granted, functionally, it's kind of the same as what we're doing up there. It's just that you don't have to write all that code, right? For the other code, every time you had to go to another object level, you had to have another for loop written out and all the code that you needed to write that out as well. Here, we just, have one for loop call, and we just pass the string back to itself, and it parses that, and we just do that as many times as we need to. Still a bunch of for loops, but less code. It's probably faster too, and less, more performant and less costly because we're not storing a bunch of specific values in a whole bunch of properties. I mean, it probably is, we are essentially re-instantiating data and value every time we call this, but my guess is it would cost less than if we did it the other way where we were calling every for loop individually in the same code block. There's probably something that compresses data that's not in scope anymore while it's being stored. Maybe. That actually would be an interesting thing to try. I'll have to mess around a bit later on and see if I can figure out a way to track that. So I would like to see if it has the same footprint, same overhead this does as the other one. Just know for sure. I think this is probably more performant overall, but I don't have anything to back that up yet. So at this point, this plugin is almost done. We got some other things we need to do. We need to expand. We need to do some changes here because we need to add in some more property handling. So we'll add another 2 there. We'll add those down to here. We need to increase this to 3 because now we have we're gonna have 4 elements coming back from the matches, and we need to make sure that we have more than 3. And then we need to pass through the other additional 2 matches. And then we need to make our changes to the turn this off. To the setDialogVariable function. So we're going to have the map index, or the map ID, NPC ID, and the map index, or the dialog index now. So let's just put this down here for a moment. We'll come back to that in a second. So for this, we need to do some handling now. Like I mentioned before at the beginning, we need to handle if the we need to handle a couple different situations. One, if the map ID is invalid, if the NPC ID is invalid or if the index is invalid. Well, with this new configuration we actually have, there's two layers to the first two, right? We have the game data, which we have to check to see if there's there's an actual map with the ID, or the ID that we have is the proper ID. And then we have to check to see if the map ID is in our plugin data now, too. So we have two different places to check it, so we're going to have two different layers of checking. The main layer is going to be checking the game data to make sure the map ID and NPC ID are valid, and that the map ID matches the map we're currently on, and that the NPC ID exists inside of our map game data. And then we're going to have another check to make sure that the map ID and the NPC ID are in our plugin data, so that the map that we're on is part of the system, so it'll be handled, or the NPC on that map is part of the system and will be handled, otherwise won't be used in the rest of this. Otherwise what will happen is we'll have errors, because the map won't be found in the plugin data, or the NPC will be found, and we'll have undefined errors. So we have to make sure we handle that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the map ID is a valid ID value, meaning it's over 0 and is not undefined. So first part of this is going to be that map ID is not null, and that map ID is greater than 0, because you can't have a 0 map or NPC ID. Now we have one other check to do, which is we have to make sure that this map ID matches the map we're currently on. So what I like to do for this is, when we have two different types of checking, so if we have, like, in this case we have the checking to make sure that the map ID is a valid value, but then we have an additional check to make sure that that value is the same as the ID of the map we're currently on. So that's technically a different check, right? It's not a validity check on the value, it's a comparison against two values to make sure they're the same. So I'm going to put this on another line. And this one's going to be game map dot underscore map ID equals map ID. Now you could do a strict comparison operator here, which is 3 equal signs, but then you would have to parse your data coming in from the plugin parameter into an integer. Because what the strict comparison operator does is it says that the values that you have in both sides of the expression of the equation have to have the same value, and they have to be the same type. So with this, if it's the same value, whether it's a string or an integer, if these are the same value, then it's true. With this, if one is a integer and one is a string, while they might be the same value, they're not the same type, so it's going to be false. So if you want to be a little more strict about what you're taking in and processing and using for data and plugin commands, you can do the strict comparison and then have to just cast your data from one type to another. I don't tend not to use it because I don't necessarily feel the need to use it a lot. I probably should use it more often, but you know, to each their own. I don't want to have to do the int parsing. And the way you would do that is you would take your, you'd probably do it up here, to be honest. You do parseInt. And to be honest, what I would do is actually, because if this can't be parsed into an integer, if it's not really a number, this is going to return a false or some other value, undefined or something, I think. Yeah, undefined. So what I would actually do is have a function, like a utility function, that we'd pass that into. We'd have it return either the number that's been parsed or some kind of default number that you would spit out. In this case, I think it'd be fine just to have the undefined, because we're checking to make sure if the values we're bringing in are undefined or not, or making sure that they're not undefined. But that would be something you'd have to put in to handle. You'd have to handle that situation, right? In this case, we're just going to use the normal comparison operator, so we don't have to deal with that. You could say that's a little bit of it's a quick and dirty thing, but at the same time, it's not really. If you have to have strict type checking, that's when you would use it. We don't really need that here, right? There's no benefit to doing that. We just care about the value. we don't need to have this absolutely be an ID. Like, if this is not an integer, that doesn't mean that there's something wrong with the data, for example. You would use like a strict comparison check when you want to absolutely make sure that the data types match. We don't really care about that here because it's just a map ID. So if the map ID is not undefined, if it's greater than 0, and if it matches the current map we're on, we continue, otherwise we don't. So let me fix that real quick. So next then in here, what we need to do is we need to make sure that the map is in our plugin data. So let's map equal, we're going to say parsed map data dot find, and then we're going to do map. I'll explain what all this is here in a bit, because I don't think we've used find yet in any of the videos so far. We talked about it, I think we talked about find and actually we didn't talk about find or filter. That's in another attempt to record this, I think. Let's say map dot or map ID equals map ID. All right, so say that you want to find some data in an array and based on conditions. How would you do that? Well, if you're thinking about it and don't know about these two functions we're going to talk about, you'd probably say, well, I'd create a function that takes in the list and then, and maybe some condition properties too, and say, loop through the list, find the conditions that meet, find the list elements that meet the conditions, return them. Which is fine. You already have something you can do that though with. It's called find, or rather filter. So what filter does is, it does the same thing and is written the same way find is, but filter is written the same way as find. It just behaves a bit differently. Find and filter are both list functions. They only work on a list, which is a really good reason for saying that you should, if you're going to be dealing with multiple objects, never to store an object inside of an object. Always store an object in a list, because then you can utilize find and filter to work with that data more easily. If you're using an object in an object that stores other objects, like you have an object that stores multiple objects, for example, you're going to have to use a for in loop to get through that and find stuff, because you can't use filter or find on an object. I mean, you might be able to use object.keys for each, potentially, but that's like a whole weird thing to deal with. And it makes, you know, going through like a loop with just like the for data of or for in loop, you can maybe do that too, but that's not the best way to do it. The best way to do it is to always store, anytime you have multiple types of data or multiple instances of data you're storing, always store it in an array, in a list, because that's what it's supposed to be used for. Technically, when I look at code and I see an object stored inside of an object, more often than not, that's a code smell to me, and I start looking more suspiciously at the data. There are times when, you know, that happens though. Whenever an object in an object is, you have an object, and in that object is another object notation, then you have another object notation, then you have another object notation, and then you have parameters inside of those objects, right? Or you have, well, actually, it wouldn't work like that, would it? Well, you have an object, and then you have like a 1, then an object, 2, then an object, 3, then an object, or something like that. Like, you're essentially creating an array, but in an object format. There's no reason to do that. Now, if you legitimately have an object that then has sub-objects, that's fine. But if you have like an object that's just storing other objects through a property, no. Like if you have something like this, like and then you have like, you know, name, whatever, some kind of properties in here. And then you have another property to something like this, right? If you have something like this, this isn't what you should be doing. If you're doing something like this, where all you're doing is just storing an object inside of a property that has no real value, then that should just be a list of objects, right? That's what I'm talking about. And again, the reason that I say that that should be the case is because then you can use find and filter to properly look through that list of objects. But so what you do is you write it like this. This arrow notation is essentially a shorthand for a function notation. So saying for this element, do this stuff. And essentially this whole shorthand is essentially like a, so it's the same as like doing something like this, I think. I believe it's the same as doing something like that or whatever. But essentially, it's a way to easily write this out to get back either a list of objects that meet these conditions or a specific object that meets these conditions. So, in the case of find, we're looking for a specific thing, right? So we're going to find what map object has the same map ID as the one we're currently on. So we're only going to get one thing here, or we're going to get the first one out of here. There are potentially multiple ones that we can find that have the same values for the conditions. It'll find the first one and return it. Now, if this doesn't find anything, if find does not find something to return, it's going to return undefined. Filter does not do that. Instead, filter will return an empty list. So you have to kind of handle them a bit differently. So in this case, then what we have to do is we have to do an if check, right? So let's say if map is not undefined, continue. Otherwise, stop processing and fail gracefully. Don't throw an error out or something like that. So once we've confirmed that the map we're on is the map that we passed through the plugin command, and that map ID is valid, and then confirm that the map ID we have matches a map inside of our map data. Map ID instead of our map data, then we need to look at our NPCs and our events. So I'm differentiating between the two. I'm saying the NPCs are going to be stuff from our plugin data, and events are going to be the stuff from the game data, because in the game map object they're called events, and in our plugin data we named them NPC lists. So they're a type of the data type is technically NPC. I did that intentionally when we were, building the data so that we could make this distinction here. And again, this is something that if you didn't know about, you wouldn't do probably. Like you were thinking about, well, the things on the, the things on the map in the editor are called events. So I'm just going to call these events in our plugin data. And as you're working through it, you're going to run into this part where you have now, if you're doing it the same way I'm doing it, you're going to have events and then events. You have to say plugin events and game events or something like that. So instead of having to do that, I just call them events and NPCs. I mean, to be honest, if you call them plugin events and game events, it might be a bit more. The code might make a bit more sense, because then you have very specific, terms for the variables themselves is what they are. But this function is short enough that when you look up at the code here, you're going to see that one of these comes from our plugin data, one comes from the game map data, and you'll be able to, the distinction should be pretty quickly made from that. If this was like a longer function that was, maybe 30, 40 lines long, I would say then we probably should have that called event, game events, and then we have the, instead of NPCs for our things, we're going to call them events. So we can say plugin events, because then that, in that longer context of the function, those names make more sense and are more easily identifiable as to what they are. So this is, again, readable. The readable code part, the clean code part of things, you have to put extra thought into what you're doing if you want to make your code readable. Again, some people might say, well, it doesn't really matter because, you know, you just look at the code and see what it says. But again, when you start thinking about that, you gotta think about the length of the code. You know, the length of the code has an impact on how easy it is to understand something. Which is why the longer your function is, the more detailed your function name should be. Because your function name needs to describe what all the code does. And if your code is 100 lines long, you better have a function name that's longer than one word. Because at 100 lines long, your function's not doing one thing. It's doing some sort of process. So that process should be somewhat documented in the function name. So like, you're not just, you know, you're not just parsing, you are parsing map data to something, you know, parsing map data to strings or something like that. So in this case, though, what we need to do here is we need to pull out the events. So we're going to say equals game map underscore events. And we could just use game map underscore events for everything going forward. It's just easier to put that into a parameter so we can use that, or a variable, so we can use that variable to make things a little bit shorter and more readable. And then we're going to do the same thing for our NPCs. So map dot NPC list. Or actually, we gotta do this one. So now what we have to do is we need to do two finds. We have to do a find on events and on NPCs to make sure that the NPC ID exists, and we also have to do a. Before we even do that, we need to make sure that the NPC ID is valid. So even before we do that, before we assign the values, we should check to make sure the NPC ID is good, because if it's not, we don't want to be assigning anything to these variables and taking up memory space. You could make an argument that maybe we should put these in the map if check, but I'm going to make the argument you shouldn't, because it's not checking anything about the map. We're now checking NPC stuff. It's a different check. Should go in a different if statement. So if NPC ID, we're basically going to do what we did with map above for the initial check for this one too. So if NPC ID is not undefined, if NPC ID is not less than 1, except at this point now we're going to stop, because we need to use the finds for this part. Because these are structured a little bit differently now, because now we have a list of events instead of just a specific object we're dealing with. And we need to go through and find the specific event that we are looking for. If we find it good, we continue, and if we find the map, the plugin NPC data for that NPC ID, we're good. We confirm the NPC ID is valid, at least here. And we have to make sure that the ID is actually in our data before we continue. So, let's events equal events.find events auto complete low crap event ID equals NPC ID, then let NPC equal NPCs.find NPC. Actually, it probably doesn't matter. It probably is event up here. I think this is a different scoping context. I don't think it overwrites the variable that we have over here. Pretty sure it doesn't. NPC and NPC ID. Then we do an if, and if event, and if NPC. So if they're both not undefined, then we continue. If one of them is undefined, we stop. And then we have our stuff down here. Comes back into play now. Okay, and we're done. So we have now updated this function and added in this stuff. We're handling all these edge cases, we're making sure our data exists, and then we're pulling that out. We have it set up so now we have we now support dialog lists for each NPC individually, and each NPC on each map that we want to support. And if we have a map we're not supporting, or an NPC we're not supporting on a map we're supporting, we're still, not going to be throwing errors because we're making sure that we're not continuing down this process chain if we don't have something that we support, or if we have something that we don't support. So now what we do is we go copy this over and run this. We should be able to see values and stuff. Still in these NPCs. So if I have that, let's go ahead and kill off this. Don't need that anymore. Turn this on. Okay, so let's see if it works. Hey, what do you know? There we go. Okay, cool. And there we go. So now we need to do some updates, because we need to make sure the other stuff is working, right? So, one, that the additional map handling is going to work, and then two, that the having an NPC and a map that we don't have in our data isn't going to cause any bugs. So, let's go ahead and create a new NPC over here. And we're going to keep this there. I'm going to go copy something from over here. So map 1 stays, map NPC 2, 3, okay. We're going to take out the else entirely, so I'm going to edit that, we'll remove that. Apply this, hit OK. And then we need to add in a new map. So first, let me go ahead and we're going to make a slight modification to this map. And then we're going to create a new map down here. Map 2, outside map, do that. We're going to do that. We're going to add in some NPCs. Let me just go copy this one down. We're going to modify this. So, map now is 2, NPC is 1, dialog is that. Then we're going to set up a self switch on this one. Copy, or rather delete that, copy paste. Change this to 1, so the first dialog and the second dialog, turn that off. Set this to A. Okay, we're going to change the NPC here to now for this one we'll do the same thing. Two and 2 since this is NPC number 2. Change the sprite. copy and paste the event page. We're going to put on the self switch over here as well. And then change this to 2-1. One thing we also have to make sure we do is, at the beginning of this, we need to clear out the previously assigned dialogue. So we're going to make sure we make this a empty string. Well, with a space in it. The reason for this is I think if we leave this as an empty string, RPG Maker is going to automatically convert it into a 0 in the output. And we don't want to have it do that. It'll look kind of weird. So, one more thing we have to do real quick is we have to set up the transfer events for the maps. So let's go ahead and make those. We're getting a bit of eventing here as well. How to make certain events. So when we make this player touch, we're going to create a transfer player. And then there should be on the same spot over here. I'm hoping. Actually, I think we're one off. Yeah, we're one off. Crap. I'll have to fix that over there. So transfer the player. On touch. Copy that over. Change this to the next spot over. Back over here, bring this back up. And we'll do the player transfers over here as well. So the reason why these are player touch is because you want them to activate as soon as the player walks onto them. Okay, so let's go ahead and test this out. So, we talk to this one, should still have the right dialogue. If we talk to this guy, it should not show that dialogue, it should show... Oh, did we not change that? Maybe we didn't change that. Huh, that's interesting. Game variable, set value, text variable ID, empty string. That shouldn't happen. One, 3, 0. Now it's not working. Oh, because I turned it off there. Yeah. Alright, so this should still be the other one potentially. NPC2, map 1, test dialog 1. That is weird. It's like this actually isn't running. Because that should be setting this to an empty string. Let me, oh, maybe I didn't. Did I pull the, no, I had to pull the plugin over because otherwise we'd be getting errors and stuff. Let me just put in some actual text there. Maybe when we're setting the value, if there's no value, it doesn't set it. I haven't actually tried checking that out before, so I've always, you know, set a value to a value. I've never like taken it and not set it to a value. Okay, that was the problem. So that's gonna be interesting. How do you handle that in NPC? So I guess we could put in some sort of We'll deal with this in episode 6, but we're gonna have to handle that somehow. That's something I didn't think about. So I didn't actually. This was something I didn't know about. So apparently when you're applying a variable, a value to a variable, RPG Maker has some built-in thing that says that if that value actually doesn't have anything in it, like if it's an empty string or maybe even just like no characters in it, has its spaces in it, then it doesn't update, which is very annoying, to be honest. But anyway, so this is working over here. This guy is doing his thing. Let's go ahead and go to the other map. Make sure the other map is working. So, NPC 1, map 2, dialog 1, yep. Dialog 2, cool. And it should be NPC 2, map 2, dialog 1, dialog 2, nice. So this is working. So cool, there you go. So we have updated this plugin now. We got one thing to deal with. We'll deal with on the next episode. And then what we'll be doing on the next episode is we're going to be putting in support for switches. So we're going to have a list of switch IDs that have to be true for dialogue to be shown. Which is why I was saying that we're going to have to test out that other thing where I wasn't sure if this code would work for a list of IDs because of this down here. Because we're going to be putting switch IDs in there. So we're going to have a list of conditions that have to be true. We'll have to bring in the switches from game switches and do some checking based on that. Again, it shouldn't be too long of a thing to actually add, because unless this becomes a problem. If this isn't a problem, then we're good, because we just put in the next layer, next thing into the data. Because what will happen is we'll have the dialogue become an object, and then we'll have conditions and then the dialogue to show, dialogue text to show, and so that'll become another object layer that we'll have to parse. And if that doesn't cause any problems, having a list of values, because they'll technically be strings, then this should be good. Otherwise, we'll have to figure out how to handle that situation. But if we don't have to handle that, if it just works, then all we have to do is change this over here, change the struct setup up here, and then reconfigure the data, and it'll be good. So it'll be like a even shorter video than this, I think. Yeah. So thanks for watching. Comments, questions, leave them below. And I will catch you guys in the next episode, where we'll be finishing off this plugin